I've teamed up with GoCar. Let me tell you why. Ireland has more cars on the road today than we've ever had before. In fact, 750,000 households have 2 or more cars. That doesn't sound like the future of driving to me. Car sharing takes cars off the road. In fact, GoCar asked 4,000 of their members, if GoCar didn't exist, would you buy yourself a car? 60% of them said they would. If you want a cost-effective and convenient way to get around, download the GoCar app and discover the smarter and affordable way to move. I'm joined by Dr Juliet Bressan. I pronounced that right, Bressan?
You did, Bressan.
Bressan. You're a GP.
Yeah.
And you're based in Dublin City Centre in Temple Bar.
That's right.
And the reason why we're having a chat today was you would have a unique insight into some of the difficulties people go through when it comes to their finances, and how if some major event happens and it changes their finances or has an impact on their finances, you get to see the physical and the mental health implications of that. And that's why we're talking to you today.
That's right. So I've been a GP for about 30 years, we'll say, in Dublin, in a variety of different settings. But certainly since the last financial crash, or the credit crunch of 2012-ish, I started to notice the very serious health impact of financial disaster. And obviously, quite a number of people went through financial disaster at that time. Businesses folded and people had borrowed huge amounts of money and bought houses and, houses abroad, for example, that didn't even exist. And there was all sorts of chaos in the financial world. And I saw, and I'm sure most doctors saw, the very real impact on that on people's health. And it was a common occurrence at that time, a common presentation for me, somebody coming in with very serious health worries, ill, overweight perhaps, high blood pressure, nutritional problems, mental health problems, or maybe a serious diagnosis that had come on probably as a result of all the stress around those kind of things. And then I still start, I've noticed that I see that kind of financial disaster quite often really impacting on people's health, whether it's divorce or whether it's bankruptcy or, fraud, for example, someone rips you off in your business. And what I'm talking about is the kind of things you can't possibly plan for. You can't, you might be the best saver, the best money maker, you're a brilliant business person, whatever it is, that you've done all the right things. But sometimes something will go wrong that's completely out of your control.
And when it's physical, and we're going to look at the physical and the mental, and we'll bring them together in a minute, but just looking at physical presentation to you, okay? So someone comes in and they have high blood pressure, or they're overweight, or they're both, or they have some other symptoms that you're looking at, and you're looking at, okay, here's a list of symptoms here. Do you have to do a whole pile of digging then to find out what the underlying problem is? Or is it that they come in with these physical problems and they present immediately and say, listen, I'm having a terrible time financially, and then which comes first, I suppose, chicken or the egg? Is it the physical symptoms, or is it the chat that comes first?
It's usually the latter, actually. People are very acutely aware of the impact of severe stress on their own bodies. Very few people don't notice. And so often what they'll do is that people will come in and say, what common thing to do is come and say, I'd like to have a full checkup. I know there's something wrong with me. I'm not well. And you start doing, physical examination, and maybe the blood pressure is up. The weight gain is very common during times of severe stress. And the blood tests might be abnormal. So they might have abnormal liver function, for example, because of eating badly and or drinking a lot. They might be smoking heavily. For example, people go back to smoking sometimes when they had given up. They may be using drugs excessively, whatever. There's often, a bit of a red flag going on that they will talk about. And during that consultation, the patient will usually say to you, we're in the middle of an absolute crisis at the moment. And they'll tell you and people confide in their doctors, it's very touching actually. And I feel very honoured that people will tell you as a doctor that the most painful things that have happened to them. But then you have a huge responsibility to be able to help. And obviously my job, I'm only a doctor, so I'm not going to be able to advise people on their finances. But I do notice a number of, I suppose, recurring themes where people have got into a roadblock sometimes. And you can do everything to help someone with their physical health, but the roadblock is still there, that the great big elephant is still in the room. And until they can solve that crisis and get that block out of the way, it'll impinge always on their capacity to just attend to their own physical and mental health.
And is it all, this is kind of probably a rhetorical question because I can guess the answer, but you're the professional on this topic, I'm not. Is it always physical health that they come to you with first? Or is it will people come to you as a GP and say, I'm really struggling and these are the circumstances that are kind of contributing to why I'm struggling, whether it's divorce or something else that's going on in their life? And then you find physical problems. Which way around is it? Again,
it's both. It's
both.
All of the above. And quite often people will present I find this quite often, say with women, middle-aged women, that they will present with a variety of vague menopausal symptoms, and you start to address that. And as you start to unpeel it, you'll see that actually they're going through a divorce, or they're in a situation where their job is a nightmare, but they can't afford to leave it, or something like that. Or they've become bankrupt, or they've suffered a business disaster, and so that makes all the physical problems a lot worse. If they were on the pig's back and having a ball, they would probably not mind the odd hot flush or whatever it is, but it becomes an absolute nightmare. The most minor of physical complaints, a headache is a horrendous nightmare if you've got to go to court the day of your divorce. So these kind of things are everything escalates.
And how often is it the individual themselves going through the problem, and how often is it that somebody else comes to you and says, I'm worried about my partner, or I'm worried about...
Yeah, I would have thought the latter is rare. Very occasionally somebody will tell me that they're worried maybe about, an elderly relative, for example. But in general, people present with their own problems. Yeah,
I know somebody, and I have to be really careful, who always rings the GP in advance of their partner going in and say, they won't tell you everything, but this is what's going on. Will you just be aware?
That's called collusion. And it's regarded as something that you don't engage in.
Okay. So people, what I'm kind of hearing from you is people are getting quite good, or people are quite aware that physical and mental and stress all go together and all part of it.
They so are. And I particularly find that with things like excessive alcohol consumption, weight gain, high blood pressure. And sometimes someone will come in and say, I'd like a checkup, grand. You start examining, you say, gosh, your blood pressure's a bit high. And they go, yes, that's because I've been very stressed. The reason I've been very stressed is my mother died. I should have inherited the house. There's a big row going on. It's a disaster. I've been turfed out of it, this. And then that's so they've already unpacked the diagnosis.
But let's assume there's a listener listening to this and they're fine and their life is dandy and everything is fine, but they're recognising some of the symptoms and the things you're talking about in somebody else. And obviously the first step is to try and get them in the door to you or to their GP, but there has to be a step before that. There has to be a conversation before that. Have you any suggestions where you can see someone else going through, and I know this is a financial podcast, but they're going through financial stress. Have you any suggestions about how they approach that? Well,
yeah, and it is very painful if you see your dear friend or a sibling or someone you love very much clearly suffering from stress and ill health and not actually doing anything about it. But you also have to be sensitive, and nobody wants to be told you should do this and you ought to do that. So there's a way of, we'd use certainly as doctors, there's a way we would suggest things. We might be, have you considered? And I think or is there any chance you might consider? That's sometimes a nice way of saying...
Instead of you
should, yeah. So once somebody says you should, they're not going to do it. So that's the first thing I'd suggest. And then I think that if somebody is, clearly very distressed in your life and you are very concerned that, say, for example, they might kill themselves. And that's quite I'm not going to say it's a common thing. Suicide's very rare. But worrying that someone might be at risk of suicide is certainly common enough, or feeling suicidal can be quite common in these situations. And it can be difficult to know what to say to somebody in those. There's no harm, certainly, in saying, I'm very worried about you. So you're not telling the person how they feel or what they should do, but certainly to let the person that you love know, I love you and I'm worried about you. What can I do to help? Or have you considered asking for professional help? Would that help? To ask them questions about it rather than telling them what to do.
It's interesting, and this is just from my own experience over the years and watching people, particularly people who are going through issues with debt, right? So they're behind on the mortgage, they're behind on loan repayments, and they're really struggling. And I've witnessed it for years where it's really building on them. And there is a point at which I'm incredibly worried about these people. And you're kind of going, oh, okay. And this is, And there's I hate to use the word tipping point, but it's the best description of what I'm trying to talk about. And then they'll hit a point, and the only way I've ever done it is I've got family involved, and we've tried to include people in our meetings about how it is, so that it's not just them in the room. You've got the partner in the room and whoever else. And that tipping point though happens, and I've seen it time and time again. And thankfully for me, everyone has got to the other side of the tipping point where they go to and they say, I can just do what I can do. I can't do any more than that. And it's when those statements start coming out of the people, I'm going to do everything that I possibly can, but that's all I can do. And they're taking responsibility for it, they're addressing it, but they're not letting it consume them the way it was before then. And I found that to be a real relief point for me as a professional, looking at it going, yeah, I'm less worried about them now, and the family are involved, and the people who love them are around them are helping them, and they've accepted they can't fix this overnight, but it will be fixed, and they'll do whatever they can to do it, but they're not consuming it anymore.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting, and I'm sure you see that all the time.
And so when a financial disaster happens to you, you have to go through a grieving.
Yeah.
So initially people say it's called denial. That's not a great word for it, but I suppose it's where you hope against all hope it's not really happening.
Yes.
And you maybe, you start putting the bills in the bin, or you're, the head is buried in this, you're just desperately trying not to believe it's really happened. And then there's a phase of utter despair and depression, anger as well. People can, and during that phase, then you can be quite at risk actually of suicide or of self-harm. And that's when people will really worry about you, because you're not yourself at all. And then eventually acceptance and resolution. So that's the part you're talking about. Yeah. But the bit in the middle where you're absolutely in despair it can be dangerous. So it's important then, if you're if you've got someone who's in that situation that you care about and you love, first of all, to let them know that you've noticed. Yeah. They're not alone, and say, look, I'll do anything I can to help you. We're here, we care about you. And to remind them they're a good person. And one of the reasons people will feel suicidal, or they'll feel that they can't engage with someone else, is they feel ashamed, or they feel that they're a bad person. They have failed. They had all this opportunity, they screwed up, or they let someone rip them off, or they married this awful person. And especially if there's anything dreadful has gone on, like violence or whatever, you can be so ashamed because you just look at your part in it. And so it's at that stage where, the loved ones and the friends and family need to say, you're a good person. You did nothing wrong here, and we're going to fix this. Everything is figure outable. And let's hang in, and, whatever you do, stay alive, stay with us.
And it's interesting because your role as a GP and my role as a financial planner, when we are invited into this world, we do carry, and I would suggest you more than me, the weight of our words are a lot stronger. Now, I'm definitely not going to go into this, but I had circumstance in recent years where I've been through quite a difficult time with something very personal. And there was a professional turn to me at one stage, and it was an off-the-cuff remark from them, and they said, Owen, you've done nothing wrong. Yeah. And the weight of that at 3 a.m. or whatever else has been incredible in terms of just the power that those things have. And whether it's me as a professional, you as a professional, or your best mate saying to you, you've done nothing wrong here, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Because money and guilt and ashamedness, all of that, you're so muddled up and so tied together, and I should be better than this. And even in the States, they're much better. You make a mistake in the States financially, you'll do better next time. You've learned from that. Here we carry an awful lot more guilt about it. And I think it's really, really important message to give to people here, that saying it out loud, you're okay, you've done nothing wrong, I love you, what can I do to help for you?
I think that's so wise. And also, people will sometimes, I'm sure, you, as you say, you've noticed it, people will come back to me maybe a year later and everything's fine and things are sorted, and they'll say, do you remember that day you said to me, you're a good mum? And I'm going, jeepers, I've no clue, can't remember any of it. But I'm so touched and so grateful that it meant something, whatever I said. Yeah. And you say these little things to people because it's just natural. You're just saying, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. You're fine. Yeah. I've got your back. We'll figure this out. The little things that you say to people, and I think it's very important always to remind someone you're a good person. That's what people fear most, is that they've done something wrong and that and they're ashamed. So it's, you're a good person. You've done that.
It is
wrong.
interesting that you talk about a year later, because I always feel that I'm very privileged, because what I get to do is I sit down with people, I build out a financial plan for them, but then I get to check in with them on a regular basis to see how it's going. And you get the same with a GP. You build up a relationship with people that you are constantly getting an update on what's going on. But tell me about that moment when you do have somebody in front of you. And I know I'm going to really simplify it. If it's a physical problem, here's a tablet or here's something. But what's the process like for somebody when they have come in, they are a bit overweight or there's other things going on, and you've recognised, okay, there's a difficult divorce in the background. What would people, if you're sitting at home and you're thinking about going to your GP, what should they expect to happen afterwards? And I know every circumstance is different. What's the process like?
Well, I mean, the initial consultation, if you haven't seen the person before, you sort of make a diagnosis as to what, the various different health issues are. Usually I'd ask to see them again. And depending on how serious their situation is, especially if there's mental health symptoms, you'll want to see them again. And it might be in 2 weeks' time. If they were very seriously ill, might be within a few days. If it's something where you feel, look, this is going to be an ongoing thing, it'll take us several months or possibly a year before you're in the peak of your health again, you'd probably want to see them within a month or two. So you will try and get, and you do tend to spend a lot of time listening in general practice. I mean, you're certainly supposed to, but GPs have an awful habit of interrupting. But it is very important to bite the tongue and listen, because you've only got 15 minutes usually with somebody. When somebody is in acute distress, you're going to have to spend more time. You can't say, right, time's up, out. You've got to listen. And certainly if you're ever in a doctor's waiting room and you're being kept waiting ages, it's because the person ahead of you is in trouble.
Yeah.
So always remember that, and one day it'll be you. Yeah. And you'll be so glad that the person behind you didn't grumble. Yeah. But it's, sometimes you may need to spend 45 minutes with someone just listening. And people will cry their eyes out, and people tell their doctor all kinds of stuff that's very, very painful. And I do think that the process of talking to another human being about your deepest, darkest suffering, even that process of talking is therapeutic. So people will feel better if they've got it off their chest. So that's number one, you've done something. And then you can also make sure to address the underlying health problems. So bring down the blood pressure, try and correct the high cholesterol, the diabetes, whatever's happened, because these things will certainly harm someone in the long term. They're red flags now. I find Irish people are great at looking at all the reasons, especially all the things they've done wrong themselves that have caused that. And this is part of what we're talking about. But they say, oh gosh, of course my blood pressure's high. I've been so stressed. I work so hard. I got divorced. I've no money. This, whatever it is. And that's why I put on the weight. And they'll go back and back and back, and all the things that they did to contribute to this. And I'm going, yeah, okay. So what are we going to do about it?
Yes.
We still need to correct it. Yeah. Every day your blood pressure is a wee bit too high. That's your blood vessels being damaged. Every day there's too much sugar in your blood. That's your eyesight being damaged. Let's just fix those things. Yeah. And the other stuff, we'll get round to that, and we'll pull in everyone else who needs to help.
And I actually love that description, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So really, if I can put your message in a very succinct way, what I'm hearing from you is whatever's happened in the past, whatever's gone on in the past, the day you walk into your office, into your practice or into your GP's practice is the day where we're trying to unload the past and look towards the future and say, right, what are we fixing? Yeah. It doesn't really matter why we're here. It's what are we fixing and what are we addressing first? And
move forward.
Let's move forward and stop looking backwards at it.
It's very important.
I think that's a really nice place to finish. I really appreciate the fact that you've taken your time. Like every guest we have, there's nothing in it for you, but you're a busy GP. This is during the working hours, and I really appreciate the time. And you know what? Hopefully the listeners get something from that. And hopefully if you are listening to this right now, and whether it's you or somebody else, it gives you, you've given, Dr. Juliet, you've given the encouragement to people just to move forward with this and to do something about it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.